All right, well, listen. So this morning we need to talk about the death of a very famous prophet. We need to talk about that. But the problem is, it's going to be real depressing and a little grisly. It's a bad story. I sort of don't know why I put it in the sermon. Well, I do know, but it's a depressing story. And I don't want to just start, a new year's worth of sermons with a depressing story. And it's a grisly story, too. So, that's coming. Just be aware. So instead of talking about the grisly and the depressing story, to start with, let's put that off a little bit. And last week, I talked about one of my dogs, and you guys seemed to really like that. So I thought, well, I have 3 dogs, why don't I talk about another one? Because you guys seem to like the first one. So let's talk about another dog. It'll be way more pleasant than the grisly prophet story. Cool? Cool. All right. So this July, Stephanie and I got this new dog. His name is Charlie, and Charlie is this dog that we got, and we sort of got Charlie under these, kind of a misunderstanding, almost. Maybe, I wouldn't say false pretenses, but definitely not true pretenses. And Charlie is, is an interesting fella. First thing you know about Charlie is not a small dog. He's not a small dog. And paired with the fact that Charlie is not a calm dog, and you have really a situation. And when I mean that, he's not a calm dog, I mean he's never calm. 3 a.m. when we're trying to sleep and he's running laps, around the bedroom, jumping up on the bed because, he can't get comfortable. He's never calm. He's not even calm when we give him those, I don't know if you guys have seen, these doggy treats that have, hemp in them. You guys seen those? Yeah. So he likes those a lot. And it's interesting because those don't calm him down, but he still begs for them. So I'm not 100% sure that he's not addicted to weed. Because he definitely is not a fan of those. So yeah, that's good. What else about him? You see, he doesn't shed. So that means it doesn't look unlike a large, fluffy love seat just wandering around the house, running around at all times. And that would be cute and all, except for if there's something, the most defining characteristic of Charlie is that Charlie is not predictable. You know how most dogs, you can kind of set your watch to what they do and when they do it and why they do it? And once you get to know a dog and you get into the rhythms and patterns of who they are, you'll be able to know what they're going to do. Well, Charlie, he's not like that. He's not predictable. Charlie, he doesn't really ever always do anything. He doesn't always get into the trash in our kitchen or our bathroom. Not always. He doesn't always get into that trash and then leave all the food behind but eat all the paper towels. He doesn't always do that. He doesn't always want to fight all the other dogs while we're walking. Not always. He doesn't always want to bark at people when we're walking. Not always. He doesn't always want to, rummage through, the brush, as we walk to try to find, bones of animals. He doesn't always do that. He doesn't always try to go into the sewage system of Ashland, going through the storm drain. Not always. He doesn't always nearly rip my shoulder out trying to get to that bread that the lunch ladies threw out at homecoming. You guys remember that? That stuff lasted for 2 months. And by the way, do we not have birds in this town? There's just this found bread at all times, all over Ashland, and I can't figure it out. But not always. Not always. He didn't always just walk by it like it was nothing, but he didn't always try to eat it either. He just doesn't always do anything, which means life is always sort of an adventure, because one never knows what he might do. We might get home and he could have done all sorts of shenanigans, or he could have done nothing. This is just the way that he is. But I should let you know that he's never met a person he didn't want to be best friends with. And so he's not definitely the best dog ever, but, he is. So that's Charlie, a big, floofy monster of a dog. And I feel like, it's interesting because I tell you about Charlie to simply illustrate one point. I tried really hard. It can be hard to do it, but I tried really hard to actually tell you nothing about Charlie. Like, everything I told you was, I just told you what he's not. I tried really hard to do that because I wanted to make the point that, hopefully you guys can picture in your heads. If you're friends with me on Facebook, you've seen 1,000 pictures. But if you're not friends with me on Facebook, hopefully you can picture this, big fluffy monster of a dog, doing shenanigans all the time. Because you can describe something in a couple of different ways. Very often we describe things, people, concepts in affirmative ways, like, he is that way, or she is that way, or, that thing is like this. But the thing about it is sometimes that's really, it's hard to do. And sometimes it's more effective just to tell you something that it's not. If I tell you that my dog is not small, that's actually, I think, a little more effective than saying, oh, he's big. Because you may have a different definition of big than I do, right? If I tell you that he doesn't always do something, that's very different than me telling you, well, sometimes he does something. There's different ways of describing things, and sometimes, as we describe certain things, it's actually very important for us to recognize that saying that something is not something is every bit as effective or more effective than saying something is. And that's especially true when it comes to religion. You see, we have a pretty big problem when it comes to God. We have a pretty massive issue with this whole concept of any kind of deity, any kind of divine, any kind of creator, any kind of anything. And that is this. If you were to randomly select someone who believes in God around the world, anywhere, so randomly select one of the 6 billion people on this planet that believes in some sort of deity, and you were to ask them, tell me something about God, and you were to do that every single day, once a day, it could literally be years before you got some agreement between people. The fact is this, there are 18 major world religions that exist. 18. And when I say major, I mean there's a whole lot more than 18, but of the ones that have tens of millions of people, we have 18 major religions, which is a lot of religions and a lot of different ways of looking at God. But that's actually deceptively low as far as how many philosophies and ideologies and ways to look at God there actually are. Because just within our religion, Christianity, there's somewhere between 30 and 40,000 denominations, depending on how you'd like to count a denomination. So when we talk about 18 religions, that's a lot of giant, large philosophical ways of looking at God. But then just with us, you got 40,000 different ways of understanding God. If you ask different Christians different questions about God, you may get 40,000 answers. I mean, that's a lot of answers. And so if we try to consider, okay, who is God? How do we understand God? How do we understand our relationship to God? How do we understand the world's relationship to God? How do we understand who we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to pray and what we're supposed to do? It can be really, really hard to describe God in the way that he is. So I want to try something to start out this new year. What if we tried to paint a picture of God by talking about what God is not? What if we spent a couple months here, a month and a half, talking about what God is not? Without trying to give definitive answers on what that means, but just this is what we know God isn't. And what if we tried to paint a picture of God that way? Maybe it'll be disaster. I don't know. We haven't done it yet. But why don't we try? And with that, well, now we got to talk about that depressing prophet story. So there's this prophet named Isaiah. You've probably heard of him. He has this giant book in the Old Testament. But also, as Christians, Isaiah is, if he's not the most important prophet to our faith, he's at least on the Mount Rushmore of prophets. He's right there. And the reason is in the Gospel according to John, John tells us that Isaiah was directly talking about Jesus. For big chunks and swaths of his prophecy, of his letter, of what he wrote, so much of that is about Jesus, which is why dozens and dozens of times we see in the New Testament somebody quoting Isaiah, and they say, yeah, hey, that's about Jesus, or hey, yeah, that's about Jesus, that's about Jesus. And that's, again, we just came out of Christmas with all that. Isaiah prophesies for that. We're about to go, here in a couple months, then after Christmas, there's Easter. We're going to talk, there'll be more Isaiah stuff. Isaiah really hits the high points of Jesus' birth and his death and all of that. So Isaiah is exceedingly important to us as Christians, and he always has been. Throughout church history, that's been Isaiah. Well, as it turns out, we're not the only ones. Isaiah was not a Christian because he lived, 700 odd years before Jesus, and so he wasn't a Christian, but he was Jewish. And in his faith and in his religion, he was just as important to them as he is to us, if not maybe a little bit more. Now, there's a bunch of reasons for that, but a big piece of that is because of when Isaiah lived. As we talked about like a month ago, we was just going to connect some dots. About a month ago, we talked about how the people of Israel, they were a theocracy. God was their king, and then they wanted a king, and God said, I don't want you to have that. And then they insisted, so God said, fine, you can have a king. And it didn't go well, which is why God said not to do that. And then they had one kingdom, and then they had all this big split, and then the kingdom divided. There was like a civil war and divided into two pieces. And then, with them now divided, they were conquered by this empire named the Assyrians. Well, during all of that time, like smack dab in the middle of that, that's when Isaiah is prophesying. That's when Isaiah is preaching and teaching and being him. Which means when we read all of these incredible passages of hope and restoration and promises and forgiveness and mercy and love in Isaiah, and Isaiah is filled with that. When we read all of that, what we have to understand is Isaiah was preaching and teaching at a time when things were dark, when things were difficult, where things were hard, where people were losing their faith. And here comes Isaiah to really give them a shot in the arm and an encouragement that they can be better and they can make it because God is on their side. So Isaiah is this incredibly encouraging prophet during this time in history when things were really, really bad. And so people, they loved him and they cared about him. He was even very close with a king by the name of Hezekiah. Well, Hezekiah stopped being king because he got old and died. And his son took over, and his son's name was Manasseh. Manasseh became the king of Judah at a point in time when the northern part of the kingdom, there was a southern part of the kingdom and the northern part of the kingdom had already been conquered by the Assyrians. The southern part had not yet. And so this part we call Judah. That's the part of the kingdom that Manasseh is the king of. And he takes over, and one day he decides he's going to do something that it's hard sort of to understand. He brought Isaiah in front of him, and he basically made this accusation, basically this trial. And he said, Isaiah, I think you are a heretic, and I think you are guilty of blasphemy. And I think that you need to be punished. And Isaiah said, what's going on? What are you talking about? And Manasseh said, well, there's these two Bible verses, these two scriptures. The first scripture comes from Exodus. It was supposedly spoken by Moses, traditionally spoken by Moses. And Moses said that no one can see God and live. The idea being that God's glory is so terrifying and all of that if a person looks at God, that they will die, right? That's sort of the idea, and that's this whole interaction between God and Moses. It's the story in the book of Exodus. And so Manasseh says, hey, Moses said no one can see God and live. And yet I'm sitting here reading your prophecy, and in the 6th chapter of your prophecy, you said that you saw God. And Isaiah said, yeah, so what? And Manasseh said, well, one of two things is happening. Either you didn't see God, and that makes you a false prophet, and I should put you to death for that. Or you did see God, and you were supposed to die, and there was a mistake, so I should put you to death for that. Now, you may recognize that as the literal dumbest thing you ever heard. Like, it's funny, like, there's always been ways to read the Bible in, like, a healthy way, and then there's always been ways to read the Bible in a really unhealthy way. And it's funny to hear about a story, 3,000 years ago, 2,800 years ago, so where people are really choosing to read the Bible in a really unhealthy way that just kills somebody for no reason. It's weird how much we haven't changed. So Isaiah hears this, and he's like, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But clearly, because that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, you seem like a really dumb person. I don't think I can argue with you. So Isaiah basically just says whatever, and he escapes. Like he just, instead of even trying to defend himself, he just runs away. So that leads to this, pursuit between Manasseh's soldiers and Isaiah. And the problem was Isaiah was pretty old at this point. And no offense to those people in the room who may, have gotten up there in age, but running is not your strong suit. Like your hip starts hurting, it doesn't work. Like they didn't have like knee replacements back then, so like, he couldn't be like half bionic. He got tired, is what I'm saying. So Isaiah gets tired. And he thinks, okay, I can outwit these guys. I can outsmart these guys. These soldiers are dumb. Their king is real dumb, so I can do this. Okay. And so he finds this log from this tree. And he hides in this log. And he thinks, okay, I'll just hide in the log. They'll run by. It'll be like Looney Tunes. I'll go back home. It'll be no problem. And that was the plan of Isaiah. And it didn't work. They caught him. And then so they said, hey, Manasseh, what do we do? And so they held him there in the log, and Manasseh said, yeah, just cut it in half. It'll be fine. That's a good execution way. Now, when you think cut him in half, you're probably thinking like the short way. Like a magician sawing his assistant in half. Like at the waist. I mean, there's a reason that would be gross enough. Like, there's a reason why everybody's really happy that that's not what happened when, the assistant comes out and like, oh, I'm really glad I didn't see somebody die tonight. That would, this magic act would have gotten dark. So, that's bad enough. So you're probably thinking, but that's not how they sawed him in half. They sawed him the long way. Think like a hot dog bun or like a sub sandwich cutting. And that's how they cut him. And tradition says that he actually lived for quite a long time. He lived until the saw went from his groin up into his mouth. And I'll be honest, that seems impossible, and I don't want to believe it because that's horrible. So we'll just say that's not true. We'll say he bled out first. But regardless, Jewish tradition is that Isaiah was killed by Manasseh by being sawed in half the long way in a log over a dumb interpretation of a couple of Bible verses. So that's a good story. Happy New Year. I tell you this story because I need you to understand how bad Manasseh was. Like I need to impress upon you how bad this king was. Because he's really the guy we need to talk about. Since we're kind of talking about who they are not, Manasseh was not a nice person. He was not a nice person. And Manasseh is his king, and he's this notorious, like maybe the worst Jewish king in history. I mean, he did basically everything you're not supposed to do. It was really the foundation of it was in religion. It was in faith. Manasseh decided he didn't want the people of Israel to be Israel anymore. He didn't want them to worship Yahweh, their God. He didn't want them to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That he just wanted to be done. He wanted to be like everybody else. And so he started really worshiping these other idols, these other deities from all the people around him. He started worshiping, Canaanite deities. He started worshiping Babylonian deities and Assyrian deities. Deities. He just started worshiping all of these things. And everywhere he went, he built up altars and he built up idols, and that's just what he did. And it's interesting because his dad, Hezekiah, was a very good king. He had systematically gotten rid of all of this idolatry in Israel during his reign as king. And here's Manasseh just setting it all back up. And it wasn't just that. Then the Bible tells us that he started doing that stuff that we were always taught in youth group not to do. We were told, you don't touch a Ouija board. That stuff's bad. He had, the equivalent of, 50 Ouija boards. He started speaking to the dead. He started doing witchcraft. He started doing, divination. Just all this different stuff. Getting in touch with all of these really ugly things. And he got so involved in it, so, just devoted to it that Again, the Bible tells us that when he had sons, when his sons were born, that instead of letting them grow up to become his heirs, he actually killed them. He sacrificed them. And we talked about this like 2 years ago. We talked about the whole concept of hell in the Bible and where it comes from, and in history where it comes from with the Jews. And we talked about how there's this valley called the Valley of Hinnom. And there was this valley where there was this deity called Moloch, and people would kill children by lighting them on fire alive and sacrificing them to this god. And that's where we come up with this concept of hell, and whether it's a metaphor and whatever, but that's what we talked about, okay? Well, to connect 2 years ago sermons, which I know you guys just memorized, to connect that to right now, Manasseh is one of the guys that did that. He took his children, his baby children, and he burned them alive for the sake of this deity. Manasseh was not a good guy. And he tried to get all of Israel to follow him. He tried to get the other people in his country to also worship these deities. And they wouldn't do it. And so he said, okay, well, you guys keep going to this temple. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. He went to the temple, and he set up an idol, an altar in the temple in Jerusalem to this goddess called Asherah. Now, we have to understand, that's as bad as killing your baby in a fire, okay? You don't put another god in the temple in Jerusalem if you're Jewish. But not only did he put an idol of another god, he chose Asherah. Asherah, for those of us who are not up to date with our ancient deities that are pagan from the Middle East, Asherah was this fertility deity that all of these various people said was actually married to Yahweh. And all the Jews are like, God doesn't have a wife? What are you talking about? And these other people said, yeah, God does have a wife. It's her. And Manasseh puts the wife in the temple. I mean, he's just offending everyone, and he's trying to get people to worship this deity. And when it didn't work, finally, he just started killing everybody. If you don't worship me, I'll kill you. One of the Bible writers who writes the story says that he killed so many innocent people that from one end to the other in Jerusalem was filled with blood, with the blood of innocent people. I mean, that's a really poetic and sort of metal way of putting it. But he killed more people than could be counted because they would not worship the gods he wanted them to worship. Manasseh was the worst king of Israel ever. So the question is why? Like, why would he do that? Was he just a true believer in all these gods? And the answer is, okay, probably not. As it turns out, like, maybe there was some level, there was some degree of, he believed in some things. I can't answer that. But if we look at history, there's a few things we have to understand. Manasseh became king when he was 12. 12. Like the time when we're all trying to figure out, like, what am I supposed to do with that pimple over here? Don't squeeze it. Don't squeeze it. Oh, you've made it worse. At that point, he's running a nation as king. Most of Israel has fallen. And it sure seems like, we put some pieces together with history, that what Manasseh did was came up with a plan. Maybe his advisors did, but he followed through with the plan. If Assyria is going to conquer all these people that are not like them, well, we'll just become like them. And then they'll leave us alone. There'll be no reason to conquer us. And so what he tried to do with Judah was make Judah into like an Assyrian suburb, so that way they would never invade. Sort of, if you can't beat them, join them. And that doesn't justify killing babies in a fire. I mean, it doesn't justify sawing a prophet in half. It doesn't justify, filling Jerusalem with blood from one end to another. But also, he was 12 when he started, and maybe we shouldn't make 12-year-olds kings. But this is what happens. So here's what we learned then. God has a response. And you can probably guess what it is, but here's what we read in the book of 2 Chronicles chapter 33. We read that Manasseh did much that was evil in the Lord's sight. Yeah, no, really. Manasseh did much that was evil in the Lord's sight, arousing his anger. That is a very understated verse. But God was mad. God got angry at Manasseh. God got very angry at Manasseh. God got really angry. God got livid. God was angry. And you're thinking, well, yeah, of course he is. Sure, of course. But you see, what's interesting about the fact that God got angry, it tells us something about God. It tells us that God is capable of anger. And again, that sounds like a really obvious point, but think about that. You see, in our world, when we talk about what anger is the thing we're supposed to avoid. Anger is a thing we're not supposed to feel. People, especially in the church, people who are spiritual, people who are, we have our act together, we can control our anger. And in our world, if you can't control your anger, if you can't manage your anger, sometimes a court will order you to learn how. Anger is not a good thing, right? Like anger, the way we talk about it, is an emotion that is negative that we should not want, or we should, once we have it, we should figure out a way to get rid of it, right? That's the whole thing. And yet here we say that God got angry. And God doesn't just get angry. As the story continues, God actually acts on his anger. He gets angry, and then he specifically does something because he is angry. What we read is that God basically says to Manasseh, hey man, you want to be like these other kings. You want your country to be like these other countries. I'll tell you what, you can have it. God does not protect these other countries who do these terrible things. There's this whole concept of what we talk about in the Old Testament. There's a massive conversation about God's involvement in things, but really the main connecting idea is that when we do terrible things, God doesn't say, cool, I'll protect you and enable you to do terrible things. So God basically tells Manasseh, fine, if you'd like to be like everyone else, I will let you be like everyone else, which means everyone else has been conquered by the Assyrians. Okay. And so God basically allows this to happen. The Assyrians conquer the southern kingdom, Judah. They take over, and Manasseh is taken away in chains. Manasseh himself is conquered. And as an aside, Manasseh's bad. Worst ever. But if you can imagine, if you can put yourself in his shoes for a second, just have a little bit of empathy for him. I actually feel bad for the guy as I read this story. I mean, I feel worse for like the burned babies and stuff, but like I feel bad for the guy a little bit. He's a 12-year-old king trying to figure something out, comes up with his plan to save his people, does unspeakable things, sells his soul to get it done, and then it doesn't work. It didn't work. He got conquered anyway. This whole plan to ingratiate himself to the Assyrians, and it still doesn't work. And so he's sitting in a cell, basically, we read. He's sitting in chains, and he prays for the first time to God. And this is what we read happens when he does. Again, in 2 Chronicles, chapter 33, we read that when he prayed, when Manasseh prayed, the Lord listened to him, and it was moved by his request. So the Lord brought Manasseh back to Jerusalem and to his kingdom. Then Manasseh finally realized the Lord alone is God. Okay, this is not the sermon point, but let's just start here. As an aside, if you ever want to know how incredibly deep the love of God is, Manasseh murdered his children, murdered a prophet, murdered people, persecuting them for believing in God. Manasseh is the worst of the worst of the worst of the worst. And the second he prays, God forgives him and restores him. I mean, that is a level of mercy and grace and love that we can't understand. And we should never, ever tell the story of God without that love at the center. But that's not the sermon. We'll come back to that later. For right now, what does God do when the man prays? Manasseh prays, and we're told he was moved. He was moved. Which, by the way, is sort of a weird thing to think about God, right? Because we think about God as being unchanging. God is immovable. But this says God is moved. I think probably an easier way to understand it is God had pity. God had compassion. God felt something for Manasseh. God felt something for Manasseh. In the story of Manasseh, this horrible person, we see two distinct emotions that God feels. God gets angry, feels anger. His anger is roused. And he feels compassion. He's moved. And not only does God feel those emotions, but God acts. God does things based on those emotions. Which is to say this: God is not emotionless. God is not without emotion. God is not that soldier outside of Buckingham Palace who can't move as it's raining and snowing and all of that, no matter what you do to him. God is not this judge sitting behind a bench with a gavel saying, listen, I'd love to do something for you here, but the law is the law, and I do the law, and do the law. God is not that the patriarch of your family that never smiled. Like when you're a kid, you go and it's like your great-grandpa or something. He's like 180 years old, and he never smiles. And everyone always talks about, that guy. And like you think he loves you, but he's never going to say it. So okay. Just got to trust. God is not this cold, distant, stone-hearted being who does not have emotions. God is not emotionless. God feels things. And God doesn't just feel things, but according to the story of Manasseh, God acts on his feelings. And that brings us to our first point about what God is not and what it means to us. Our first point about who God is not is this: God is not without emotion. So we in our faith are not expected to be either. When I was growing up, I was taught a really interesting thing. And it made so much sense at the time. It really did. When I was a kid, when I was a teenager, and even when I was in college, it always made sense. I was always taught, okay, your feelings don't matter. Your feelings don't matter. It doesn't matter what you think, doesn't matter what you feel, doesn't matter. Your emotions are totally meaningless when it comes to your faith. Because your faith has to be rational, your faith has to be logical, because your faith needs to be based on the truth, and the truth is always cold, distant, rational, and reasonable. Always. So it doesn't matter if something doesn't feel right to you. It doesn't matter if you've got an emotion that goes against something that somebody's saying. It's all about being rational and being reasonable. Always. And that made a lot of sense. So I thought, well, you're right. Yeah, your emotions, my emotions do lie to me. Like, I dated a lot of girls that were bad news. My emotions have lied to me in my day. So it made sense, okay? Your emotions lie to you. But it's funny because I don't think that's true anymore. Like, my emotions lie to me, but I don't know that totally squares. For one, you know what else lies to us is reason and logic. Like, we have made, if you've lived for more than like 20 minutes in this world, you've made a really logical decision that turned out to be really dumb. So there's that. But there's also this. If God didn't want us to be people with emotion, then why did God make us as people with emotion? What is the point in giving something that is so much a part of us, our feelings, our emotions, and then say, yeah, don't use that. I mean, it's like 80% of me some days. Yeah, don't touch that part. Yeah, don't do that. I think instead, I think God gave us emotions for a reason, and the reason is because God made us in his image, and God is not without emotions. And look, I don't know how far this goes. There's a reason we're doing it in this series. There's a reason I didn't say, well, God is emotional. I don't know how far this goes. I don't know. I mean, we can say God's emotional. You guys, we get the wrong idea. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying, everything God does is based on, the fleeting fancy of a feeling today. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that when we deny the emotional side of us, when we say, okay, I am supposed to be a person of faith, and that means ignoring how I feel, I think we're ignoring who God is. And I think we're ignoring who God made us to be. God gave us a brain that we can be reasonable and logical with. It's great, and sometimes it's flawed. And God gave us a heart that we can be emotional and feel with. And sometimes it's great. It's always great, but sometimes we mess it up. God loves all of us, not just the brain part. God cares for and wants us to follow him with all of this, which means, guys, I would love, there's so many people, this is maybe going off script a little bit, maybe saying too much a little too candidly. I talk to a lot of people who have lost their faith or they've walked away from the church. And you know what it is like 90% of the time, anecdotally, is that they had this idea they were told they had to hold to. And then their feelings said, but I can't anymore. And instead of honoring that and saying, okay, the church has answered with, well, get out. Your feelings don't matter. I submit that our feelings matter. And I submit that potentially, when our feelings and our logic are at odds, sometimes the logic needs to go away. And I submit that sometimes the emotions need to go away. But both of them are part of us. And both of them are at the heart of God. We believe in a faith in which we are saved by grace and grace alone. Without grace, no one is saved, right? What is grace other than a completely illogical act based on positive emotions? For God so loved the world, he sent his one and only Son. That is not logical. That is not reasonable. That's not fair. There's nothing fair about my salvation or yours. But God, in his emotions towards us, because he loves us, he moved, he acted. The same God that got angry and then had compassion is the same God that loves us, and that's the same God who made us with emotions, which is an invitation to be yourself, to be emotional, to have feelings, to think logically, and to know that God's love covers us. God's love embraces us as we hold all of these things in balance. And God's love invites us to follow him. Not as we might be if we shut off our emotions, but as we are. So when the musicians are going to come forward, they're going to sing a song. We offer this invitation each and every week to take God up on his offer, to embrace this truth, to change our minds about God in repentance, to be baptized as a symbolic act of that repentance. If you've already made that decision, we got a nice warm baptistry, all sorts of people that can do it. Let's talk. If you're an immersed believer in Christ, you're looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it. We do serve a perfect God. We want to connect, we want to call, we want to cultivate, and we want to be people who can worship God with our whole selves, our hearts and our brains. Doing so in perfect trust, knowing that God's love is big enough for all of us. As we stand and as we sing.